will switch to sharing my screen now.
Yep, I'll just stop my share.
Oh,
perfect.
Let's see if this works. Could someone give me a wave if they can see my screen?
That's perfect, Brian.
All right, fantastic. I'll get going. And here we go. Hi there. My name is Dr. Brian Cook. I'm based at the University of Melbourne. I'm a human geographer who studies risk and human behavior using participatory and action-oriented engagements. I'm just going to hit a timer because I'm also a stickler for time, and I'll make sure I keep to it. Today, I'm going to present on research that engages with cassava farmers in Northwest Cambodia. The work explores their decision-making and their uptake or not of agricultural technologies and practices. The paper for this talk is now drafted, so thank you for the nudge on that. And I'm happy to share that if people are curious or want to have a read. You just have to promise to provide some feedback and not share it any further. I'll keep to time. I really enjoy questions, and so we'll hopefully get that through. I should also note that I was a little slow in getting Alice in my slides, and I just want to take a moment to thank her for her efforts in organizing these kinds of workshops. There's a lot of work involved, and I know that we're all grateful. I'll also note that I'm running an inception meeting in an hour, and so please forgive me for not sticking around to the very end. I thoroughly enjoy the questions and back and forth, but I have to leave to jump through the hoops of donors in a short time. So let's jump into this right away. There we go. Today I'm going to begin with a brief description of the research so that you can understand the basis of the argument I'm going to offer. I've relied heavily on excerpts from the interviews with farmers and their households, and each of these are representative views that are drawn from many of the engagements that we've taken over the last 5 years. I'm not going to go through each of the citations during the talk. There's just not enough time, so please kind of skim those as we go. In brief, so that you know where this talk is heading, the argument that I'm going to make is that agrarian change is a product of an assemblage of experiential learning and social relations. And what I mean by that is that farmers have extremely limited capacity and opportunities to affect change in their lives. Now, no doubt they are adaptive, creative, rational, and highly adept at agricultural transitions, but they are also subject to innumerable and often exploitative relations, which structure their options and their actions. So for this audience and your focus on effective farmer communications, my talk, I think, will act as a counterweight or a reminder that communications aimed at farmers must account for their situations. What our research shows is that awareness isn't a problem for these farmers. They are well aware of options and alternatives, and that change is much more a product of opportunity and support. And so as an aside, the follow-up project that I'm running the inception meeting for later on is actively supporting farmers in accordance with their expressed desires and then measuring the impact of that kind of support-based form of agricultural extension. So stay tuned, I suppose. I'm not going to go into all the data that the project collected as part of its effort. There's a ton of data. We're going to focus on data arising out of the 300 household interviews. I do think it's important that we talk about the theory of change. And I don't want to belabor this next point, though if you're interested, I've written a review paper on the deficit model and communications in the context of climate change, which is open access and linked at the bottom of the slide, as well as a review of agricultural extension, also open access and linked. In general, I don't believe that communications prompt lasting behavior change in people who wouldn't already be well on their way to making those behaviors. I appreciate that the communications discourse is where some of the most compelling critiques of one-way communications or deficit-based framings can be found. So please don't feel that I'm painting with too broad a brush. But I think it's important that we ask ourselves what we expect of communications. If the assumption is that an external party can inform, educate, manipulate, nudge, or otherwise attempt to influence farmer behaviors, I don't think this is an effective theory of change for a lasting intervention. For me, communications are part of a wide assemblage of activities contributing to behavior over time, though it's a small and relatively weak lever with which to affect farmers' behaviors on its own. And I hope that doesn't upset anyone. I suspect people who are involved in comms know this very well, but it's, I think, important that we set the bar appropriately for communications. we conducted a baseline to find out who we were dealing with. And so the baseline survey describes the cassava farming households who were sampled for the research, offering some insights into the general character of the households. About 400 of them participated. These are predominantly households of 4 to 6 individuals with a male head who's married and who has completed primary school level education. There are a mass variety of circumstances, and this is especially pronounced with regard to the amount of accessible farmland, and the nature of land titles in Cambodia is quite a sensitive topic. Most importantly, from the quantitative survey, with regard to the issue of agricultural extension, the households identified specific agrarian changes that they believe would benefit them, and transitioning to fruit tree production was the most popular one. Though transitions are bounded by an individualized framing in which responsibility rests almost entirely with the household and the extended family. So the isolation and portrayal of agrarian change as an individualized activity is both supported by the quantitative data as well as the qualitative interviews, which also hint at the informal social relations that contribute to on-farm practice change. I'm now going to move to the qualitative findings in order to better understand or explain the rationalizations that farmers tell us about and exhibit as part of their decision-making in the context of agrarian change and agricultural extension. So why did farmers transition to cassava? Well, the overwhelming majority of cassava farmers describe the process of transitioning to cassava production as the outcome of multiple social relations, many occurring simultaneously through different social networks. In general, the farmers become aware of a possible alternative crop, in this case cassava, through their social networks, which act as a mechanism of awareness raising. For our sampled farmers, this was overwhelmingly their neighbors. More than 95% of them identify a neighbor as their primary source of information. In many instances, this neighborly relation also had ties with Thailand or Vietnam, or with traders who visit rural parts of Cambodia to purchase directly from farmers. When asked what made you start planting cassava, most of the farmers described a successful neighbor who had already implemented the transition, who those particular respondents would emulate. And you see in the quotes there that they follow one another. They are very apt and keen to replicate what their neighbors are doing. So how do farmers verify the information or the practices that they receive through various channels? Well, perhaps the most important finding of the research is recognition that agricultural extension is not a top-down activity involving experts, the state, or donors. Instead, agricultural extension is an assemblage of local social practices that are almost entirely informal and, for the most part, not for profit. And this is unlike the characterizations of agricultural extension within the vast majority of the discourse, as well as amongst the Sustainable Development Goals or the IPCC reports that link farmer decision-making with climate change adaptations. Family and already trusted relations are how farmers assess the effectiveness of the information or awareness of a new practice. Throughout the 300 engagements, these relations created an ability for farmers to vicariously experience alternate practices, which is their way of informing themselves about future decision makings. And I think that that's really an essential recognition. So we know why they transition, we know where they get their information. Where do farmers get official information or expert advice? The final question from the quantitative survey asked who has the power to support their efforts to implement change. A large number of the respondents answered with variations on family. We created categories to be as fine as possible, but 81% of respondents included one or more of the answer: myself, the head of household, family, children, grandchildren, husband or wife, or parents, with only 14% of respondents even mentioning an organization or an individual outside of that kind of familial unit. And so what we see is that they don't get expert advice. And we ask them explicitly through follow-ups. Are you sure you didn't talk to the agricultural department? Did no one come by and offer advice? Did nothing. And so what we see is it goes back to these neighbors. And I just want to stress how important they are. So these farmers are disconnected from what we understand or what the discourse tends to portray agricultural change or extension services as, which means that many of the official and expert efforts to support them are disconnected from how they inform themselves, which I think is a real challenge for those of us involved in agrarian change and research that aims to support these farmers. Throughout the talks, though, there was this one kind of actor who was in almost every interview, and that was the pesticide vendor. So across the 300 interviews, there's a contradiction between feelings of isolation and this universal presence of the pesticide vendor. As mentioned in the preceding experts, the pesticide vendor is a constant, non-familial social relation, and in most cases, the only expert that these farmers have any contact with. And this finding is relatively unsurprising given the for-profit change to the business model around agricultural extension. But the farmers were very dubious about the pesticide vendors' vestedness. They are well aware of the profit motivation of official extension activities and individuals. And therefore, again, they revert to their neighbors and to trusted social relations to make sense of advice or change or witnessing of other practices or hearing of a new crop or a new behavior that they could implement through their existing social relations. So in conclusion, almost right on for 10 minutes here. What have we shown in our research? Well, farmers are alone, or they feel alone, and are subject to extreme precarity and exploitation. Any action that they take is debt fueled, and I didn't go into the microfinance industry in Cambodia, but it's an incredibly problematic lending relation. So making change is an extremely costly and complex decision for them. They don't lack information, but they lack trustworthy support. The guiding question of this talk was how powerful are social relations? And I hope some of those excerpts, if you were able to skim through them, or if you just take my word for it, is to see that they are incredibly important. And for many of these farmers, they are their sole source of reliable or trustworthy information. One of the questions guiding this talk was what factors drive behavioral changes amongst Cambodia cassava farmers, and it's their neighbors, it's their family members who are also often neighbors, and their trusted social relations who are neighbors and family members. And so coming around to communications and effective engagement with farmers, I hope that those sort of findings and you know, there's a great deal of data behind them to support that, beg the question about then what is the role for communications in that sort of situation? And I hope that this group and its activities can then take that kind of question on. So there's lots of ways of getting in touch with the project and getting in touch with me and you know, all our funders and people who have contributed, including all of my colleagues. And I think I'm pretty close to time there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Great, thanks, Brian. Excellent presentation, and you've raised lots of questions, and even you provoked a few probably questions as well in people's minds. I have some questions, and also if the audience has questions, please put them in the Q&A box. I'm quite interested because you said that that people seem to get their information from the successful neighbour. That was one of those key points. So where do they get their information from?
Yeah, it's like that. Where does it begin, or how long is a piece of string? Yeah, we get the same story. It's a network, and I think that's the best way of describing this sort of intervention. There were instances of particularly influential wealthy farmers or the village leader acting as a kind of someone who would try things earlier, an early adopter, if you want, and they would emulate that process. There was also examples of some outreach from traders, from there's all sorts of people trying to support them, but it always came back to them describing, observing neighbors and engaging with neighbors, speaking with their neighbors. And so, you know, adoption is not this one moment in time where they actually put a new crop in the ground. It's a very extended process that's occurred over sometimes years. And there are many relations that lead up to that. And throughout all of those interactions, it's constantly back to the neighbor to have those discussions. And so I would never say it's only neighbors, but I think neighbors are the determinants. They are the way that people sound out their thinking, they hear advice, they're engaging with people who are living in the same system and working in the same agricultural system. So the advice that they get from neighbors is someone who probably also has to have these high debt rates and is worried about climate change and is worried about traders. And so they feel empathy from their neighbors. And so it's a constant effort to consult with them.
Okay. And so what does that mean, do you think, for how we design projects to reach out to farmers? I mean, how do we design a project that takes into account the social networks and these the importance of who's next to you and who's farming next to you?
Yeah, I struggle with the role for communications, and it depends how you define it. Communications houses such a broad, from deficit to
No,
dialogue.
but I mean, not just communications. We're talking about communications are a two-way thing, but understanding how to enter into these social networks and provide support. You say
Yeah.
that farmers are isolated, so how do we make them less isolated?
Yeah, well, we engage with them. I mean, one of the
But is
very
that not
fortunate.
communication?
Um,
Engaging?
it depends how it's done, I suppose. And so,
Okay.
for example, in this project, we spend a lot of time with them. We have teams in villages listening with no agenda. We don't come thinking mechanization or transition to
So
wherever.
would that be a good form of communication then, sitting down, taking a lot of time with these farmers, listening to their perceptions? I mean, and
Depends how you
understanding
define
that
it.
before you design interventions. Were your results of this study, I mean, they similar to the results that you've seen in other studies? I know this has been looked at in the importance of social networks and farmer groups. Have you seen that the same or similar findings?
We see some similarities, the importance of those social networks. Does it stand out exactly? The northwest of Cambodia is very difficult because it's undergoing such rapid boom and bust transitions.
Yep,
So I think what we
sure.
see there is a very amplified version of what is hinted at in other locations.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think. It's hard to say. There's a
Yeah, no,
bazillion
true.
research bits out there, so I wouldn't want to
Okay.
claim too strongly that originality, because I'm sure one of the audience is probably saying this is all
That's
hat.
okay. No, I was just wondering if there was anything surprising in this Cambodia particular study, because I think all of this is very context dependent, and we'll see
Yes,
that through the other speakers today, that you really have to understand your context, which I think is a really good reason for really communicating well, sort of two-way, understanding what's happening. But
yeah,
listen, I've got a couple of questions here. Excellent presentation, Brian. This question, since you said that farmers are trusting their village leaders from whom the technologies are passing on, would it be worth identifying those village leaders who could be the sources from which those technologies could be passed on?
Okay, I'm going to jump in there. They
Yep.
don't necessarily trust their village leaders. They emulate, they watch,
Yep.
they study, but these are highly imbalanced power relations in these villages. And the village leader is often as dangerous and risky as anyone. I mean, let's appreciate this is post Khmer Rouge. This is a place where there are lingering warlords who were affiliated with those groups, who are now in control of villages. So it's fraught. Those relations are fraught.
Okay.
And people are so precarious and impoverished in many senses, and they are holding on very tightly to the kind of last rungs of the ladder, with the next stop being landlessness or debt bondage into brick kilns, all sorts of awful processes. And so these farmers have to be extremely cautious about who they trust and who they engage with.
So would
I
that
wouldn't
be a little bit,
characterize the leader.
so would that be a little bit like the second question here is, what's the main reason they don't listen to experts? Is it because there's a disconnect, or is there a lack of trust? You may have sort of answered that in your last answer.
I wouldn't separate the two so much. I mean, one of the things that we do is our in-country partners we formed an NGO with them to support them, but they had already been active in these communities for more than a decade. They knew people, they had relationships with them, and they had formed a trusted relationship with them and then worked with us. And so this isn't about, me as a white male, kind of coming from Australia to kind of come into these villages. It's more me working with existing organizations in the area and supporting them and working with them, who are then
great point.
engaging with farmers. And so I think it's really important that we recognize the need for culturally sensitive people with experience, with long-term relationships with these individuals, founded on familiarity and trust.
Okay. One last question here. Are the communications predominantly face-to-face, or are there conversations through social media, Facebook groups, WhatsApp? How are farmers communicating?
Yeah, well, pre-COVID, everything was face-to-face. I'm sure you'll hear that a million times, right? And so we have had to switch into some different forms. They're not what we were seeking, and they're not something that we think is ideal. We would prefer it to be face-to-face, and we're very much looking forward to returning to the field early next year. But that's not to say they aren't useful. And I would hate to come across as someone who's anti-comms or something like that. Communications are really a key part of any broad holistic approach to supporting farmers. It's what we expect of it, which I think I said in the talk. It's
Yep.
we can't rely on the comms to do the hard work of building the relationship. The building of
Yep.
a relationship is that coffee or beer out in a village, hearing about people's lives and really listening and
Yep.
developing support that starts there with what they've told us and what they've asked for, and rather than the opposite.
No, that's great, Brian. And I think that's what we've been talking about as part of the series, that it's not just comms as in sending a poster or sending something to tell people what to do. It's actually about communicating with a two-way conversation, really listening to both parties and understanding. And in some cases, many parties, as we'll see from Rika's presentation at the end. Thank you so much, Brian, for joining us. Good luck with your inception meeting today. I know you're carrying on with this project, so all the luck with that. And we'll look forward to hearing how that goes and feedback on it. So thank you very much.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all.
You know, it's great. Thank you. Okay, I'd now like to introduce our next speaker, Laura Kwong. Now, Laura's